All right, so we're going to talk about for this presentation the two New Deals that Franklin Delano Roosevelt puts through. In total, Roosevelt spent more on building roads, dams, airport, bridges, and housing than anyone else in the history of the United States presidency. And really, this is when the term liberalism, as we know it today, uh, takes on its modern meaning. And the whole idea of this is that the government should be in charge to an extent of the people's welfare. Okay, so the government is there to uplift the less fortunate, so to speak. And this is really the 1930s is when this idea of liberalism, meaning that the government has a social contract, so to speak, for people who are less fortunate. This is all because of FDR's New Deal. All right, so obviously Herbert Hoover loses the 1932 election, right? No president could have happened on his clock what happened, and then him win the election. So FDR gets voted into power quite easily. He's actually the fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. Um, Very few knew that he actually had polio and he was in a wheelchair. But in the election of 1932, in his speech, he promises something, a new deal, but he only vaguely hints at what it is. Um, in his presidential candidacy, he argued for a balanced budget and said that Herbert Hoover had actually spent too much of the federal government's money. And really, the reason that many believe that he won instead of Herbert Hoover, besides that Herbert Hoover was the president during the Great Depression, is that FDR wanted to repeal prohibition. Now, I don't know if that is true or not, but many people argue since prohibition was still going on and since it was such a unpopular thing, FDR came out and said he wants to repeal that. So he takes that into effect. Um, this is also the time, like we kind of I talked about earlier, just that earlier slide, is that the New Deal brings to the forefront the idea of freedom as being a public guarantee of economic security by the government. Um, it means that not only will the federal government help you, but your regional government will help you, and they will do this by economic planning. This is when the idea of Social Security comes up. FDR creates this Fair Labor Standards Committee, which talks about a minimum wage for the first time, etc., etc. So this is freedom has the idea of freedom has kind of changed a little bit, especially while FDR is president, and it deals with the government is there to ensure everybody's prosperity. Okay. The, the whole idea of the coming of the New Deal is that it was an alternative to socialism, fascism, and unregulation. By the early 1930s, everybody was afraid of the Soviet Union, and Mussolini in Italy is kind of starting to make waves. So people in America kind of understood what fascism was in 1932. Hitler won't come into power till 1934, 1935, but fascism has already started to create this thing, and it's very anti-democratic. And people in the United States know this. It was also against the New Deal is also against unregulation, right? Hoover and a lot of his advisors said, let the economy do what it will. It'll come back at some point. You know, the economy will go through some bad things, but it'll come back at some point. FDR says this is not how to help the economy. The economy needs help, and the government are the people who are able to do that. He didn't really have a blueprint, so to speak, but his advisors um, basically said that big business had too much power, and they contributed to the depression by keeping prices artificially high and failing to increase workers' purchasing power. So basically, they're saying since supply outweighed the demand, it still didn't matter because they were keeping the prices high artificially because of all of these monopolies and because they were in cahoots with each other, but they weren't raising the wages of the workers. So basically, workers' wages were not going in the same direction as inflation. Um, uh, this is when FDR, who Teddy Roosevelt also tried to do the same thing, says all of these big businesses should be broken up, especially the ones that aren't regulated, um, and they need to be managed. They need the government to looking over them, right? They they can't be unregulated. They need somebody looking over them, or they're just going to keep committing fraud. They're going to keep doing things illegally, and this will hurt the economy. Um, Also, during this time, there was another banking crisis, and banks by early 1933 were on the verge of collapse. There was no money left in them, and Many of the banks didn't have enough money to pay people withdrawals, so a lot of the banks were suspended. So what FDR does after he's elected, this is in early 1933, is he calls a holiday, so to speak, and calls Congress in to pass the Emergency Banking Act, which provides funds to shore up institutions. This is when the FDIC is created. Um, you see that everywhere. That's a government system that ensures accounts of depositors. So now, when you see in those movies everybody talking about robbing banks, and then they say, well, this isn't your money, this is the government's money. What they're saying is no matter what happens to a bank, if they're part of the FDIC, then the government will back them up. Okay. um, he also banned banks from getting involved in the stock market. And this actually kind of saves the banking system, the modern banking system as Americans know it. But at the same time, this is when the government controls much more. And so after this, well, actually, this is all during this. This is kind of called the first 100 days of the first New Deal. This is kind of a famous term for historians and sociologists and even economists and people who study the New Deal, even in today. Um, and now we make a big deal about it. But really the first 100 days of a presidency became important because of FDR, and this is because he has a flurry of initiatives, so to speak. Seizing on the sense of crisis, he passes a rapid amount of things, like the NRA, and we'll talk about these acronyms, the NRA, the PWA, the AAA, etc. The NRA was the National Industry Recovery Act, um, and it was modeled on things that were going on during World War One, which basically the NRA worked with business leaders to establish codes for output, prices, and working conditions. Um, it's kind of a This is not an open shop anymore. It's not deregulation. It's not laissez-faire, invisible hand stuff, let the market do what it wants. But rather, it's a way for the government to regulate big business. And it's fairly controversial because only a handful of people are writing the codes for the new NRA, saying what a business can do and what a business can't do, and they use this to their advantage to manage prices, inflation, workers' rights, etc. All of these things that big businesses do, and it was a bit of a letdown actually. This was kind of the first time that the government dips their hand into big business, and they don't really come up with any obvious ideas to help turn the economy around. But um, it's still one of the first steps that FDR takes in the government regulating businesses. Okay, which is important, especially in America. We still have this conversation today all the time. How much control should the government have over business, especially private businesses and things like that? Um, the other problem that was going on at the same time is a quarter of the people were still unemployed by May 1933. So what he does is he creates the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which is the idea that he makes grants to local agencies to aid the impoverished, but FDR was much more into creating infrastructure and doing things that kind of Herbert Hoover had started, and he was much more into doing things for paying people to work as opposed to just paying local agencies to give money to people who are impoverished. Although he does do a lot of that. Um, he also creates the CCC, which if any of you have, especially this was very big in California, Nevada, even into Oregon, maybe even in Washington and Idaho. I haven't seen that many CCC things in this area. It's more in California, but basically what the CCC was um, young men working for the forest preservation, flood control, improvement of wildlife and national parks. So by 1942, in about 10 years from when it was enacted, more than 3 million people had been employed in the camps where they basically received $30 a month. So what the CCC was they would hire young men who were out of a job, and they would go build hiking trails, shore up dams, build roads in national forests. A lot of the forest roads that you drive on today, if you guys camp or hike or fish, especially in California and Oregon, these were created by the CCC. These young men who did not have jobs, FDR employed them, and for the next 10 years they built a lot of these things. He also came up with the PWA, which is the Public Works Association, which appropriated $3.3 billion, which is a lot back then. I don't know how you would account for inflation today, but we're talking billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in today's standards. And the PWA built roads, schools, hospitals. The PWA built the Triborough Bridge, which is one of the largest bridges, one of the most famous bridges in America, right? Is connecting New Jersey and New York. They built the Overseas Highway from Miami to Key West, which if any of you have ever been on it, it's amazing. It's a really cool thing. I mean, it's shocking, the engineering and the ingenuity that went into this and the hard work. Um, he also created the Civil Works Administration, employing 4 million people to build highways, tunnels, courthouses, airports. But the thing is as he was employing these people and the costs kept spiraling up, people were saying, you're breeding a whole generation of people who are dependent on the government. And so FDR kind of pushed back a lot of these first New Deal ideas, because the government was spending so much money putting these people to work. And perhaps this is very controversial in a lot of parts of America, even into today, how much the government should, you know, put into giving people money and giving them jobs, etc., etc. And probably one of the most controversial of all of FDR's policies as president was the Tennessee Valley Association, which was the government built dams to prevent floods and deforestation in the Tennessee River, and at the same time these dams created cheap electricity for homes and factories in an area where this is deep Tennessee, and this is the 1930s, by the way, and many of these people still did not have electricity, and the government went in and built dams to create this electricity. And for the first time in the history of America, the federal government was in the business of selling electricity in competition with private companies. So this was a very controversial thing. you know, how much control should the government have, especially when they get into things like the electricity game, right? I mean, that's dipping your hand in where private companies only were before. So that was very controversial. Um, he also created the AAA, the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Um, This is where the federal government raised farm prices by setting quotas for major crops, and they also paid people not to plant. Um, f- f- or to grow livestock. For example, in 1933, they over 6 million pigs were slaughtered and not used because they wanted to keep the price of pork high for the farmers, so the farmers would get a good deal. This really upset people, especially since the 1930s. You're still getting out of the depression. There's still a lot of people who are poor, who aren't being fed, and in a lot of places the federal government was telling people not to plant crops to keep the price high because the supply was way too high for the demand. So FDR made a lot of decisions that were tough, and whether they worked or not, you can look into yourself. You could maybe even do the PowerPoint about that. But he still made decisions like that. Um, but the AAA did succeed significantly in raising prices and income for farmers. Um, for farmers, all, for some farmers, but not all of them benefited. Only basically those that owned the land, right? Not those working on the land that were owned by anybody else. At the same time, you also get the Dust Bowl, which you can see. I put a couple videos about it on this week's assignment, and you can kind of see pictures of it. Um, and this was basically the biggest natural disaster in American history until Hurricane Katrina. So not only, and you'll see in the video kind of what caused it and why it happened. But this was a devastating thing to the American economy and to the farmers. Um, so what ends up happening after the first New Deal in 1933, the beginning of 1934, is the first New Deal kind of comes to an end, and not a whole bunch of progress had occurred. Houses had almost stopped being built. Um, so FDR creates the FHA, which we know of today, which insures millions of long-term mortgages. So this he tries to make it cheaper to buy single-family homes than it is to actually pay rent. We have the FHA today. He repeals prohibition. He does a lot of things in kind of his first 100 days, and also the first New Deal. But whether it was a success or not is still debated today. Um, and also the Supreme Court kind of gets involved in all of this. They say that the first NRA, the first Recovery Act, National Recovery Act, was unlawful because it delegated legislative powers to the president and attempted to regulate business that did not engage in interstate commerce. We talked about the Interstate Commerce Committee earlier. They're still functioning, but the Supreme Court says it's not constitutional to regulate business if they're not trading in between states. Okay, the AAA also falls because people felt that was too much Congress control over the economy, and people were mad, especially after the Dust Bowl. They see that the government is paying people not to plant when people are hungry, and things are still a bit of a mess in 1932, 1933, and Americans weren't happy with the idea of raising prices for farmers when a lot of people were still hungry. Um, so by the end of his first 100 days and the first New Deal, it kind of ends without curing the Depression. So what ends up happening, which we'll talk about next, is a bit of a grassroots revolt comes up, and so FDR comes out with his second New Deal. All right, so the first New Deal spent quite a bit of money, government money, and in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't. For the most part, by 1933, after the first 100 days, it had kind of failed, especially in a lot of things that it had set out to do. So what happens is kind of this grassroots revolt happens, and not like a kind of like the Tea Party, just on the different political spectrum. This was the mobilization of millions of people who were in the mass production industries, uh, but had also resisted unionization. Okay, so and a lot of people call this America's labor's great upheaval in quotation marks. And actually, the militancy was quite surprising. Um, but the difference between this mobilization and earlier ones is that the government was actually on their side. And not to mention, by the 1930s, the people who were doing this strike, so to speak, were had been born in the United States and spoke English. So they had a bit more backing by the general public because they weren't immigrants anymore. And a lot of them were socialists and communists who had survived the 1920s, although many in America did not know that. Um, what happens is since we talked about wages weren't living up to inflation, people begin to organize and they begin to write to FDR about the deplorable conditions, and they start writing pamphlets, saying our forefathers fought for political liberty, and that was taken away from us, and it's made meaningless by business owners and industrial despotism. Right? It's very charged language. These pamphlets come out, and everybody's reading them because they're in English, and by the 1930s most people could read or speak English, the industrial workers, right? So in 1934 what happened is 2,000 strikes occurred, and many of them were violent. Um, there were 400,000 people went on strikes in New England, which was kind of a textile area still. Um, Even into the South, which was even more textiles. I guess New England would be more industrial than the South, but I mean, we're talking about people who make shirts to people who make cars who make airplanes. Um, all of these things, everybody was striking. It wasn't just one sector or the other. Um, and most of them succeeded in one way or the other, except for the textile industry in the South. And this is when the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was created. And what this was um, 30 leaders for industrial workers called for the creation of a union for industrial workers. And in 1935, there's a John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers walked out of a conference of all of these different industrial working unions, and he creates the CIO. And the CIO's aim was to secure industrial democracy and economic freedom for every industrial worker, or basically a fair share in the wealth of their labors and a voice in determining working conditions. Okay? After the CIO was formed in 1936, the United Auto Workers Union was formed kind of within the CIO, which is still a very, very prominent and powerful union in today. In fact, it may be, besides the Major League Baseball union, the second strongest union in America, and the teachers union as well. Um, and the and The UAW was very good at they're the ones who unveiled the sit down tactic, and it worked. So what they would do is they would go to work, but then they would sit down so the company couldn't bring in breakers or scabs, so to speak, people who would work while the union workers were striking. So from Cleveland to Flint, Michigan, where Michigan was still the major auto basically the major auto area of the world. It was kind of the nerve center of automobiles. Um, what they do is they go into these plants, they sit down and they settle down and they start talking about their disputes with the owners while the wives are bringing them food, right? Very good tactic. So in 1937, General Motors negotiated, and and they came to a collective bargaining agreement. Okay, so by this time, the CIO, the UAW itself, had 400,000 members. Steelworkers do the same in 1937, and U.S. Steel, probably the single most important company in the United States up to this point, agreed to recognize the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and by 1940, union membership had reached 9 million. So this is a bit blasé or kind of banal kind of stuff, but it is important to realize that even into today, the United States has more people who are in unions than France does, which is surprising when you consider, a lot of times Americans make fun of the French people and Western Europeans for being socialists, unionized, this and that. The United States today still has more union workers than any of those countries. And a lot of this has to do with this 1930s idea and the government saying it's okay, the government giving them okay to strike and to become part of a union. At the same time, you also get the second New Deal after the first one doesn't work so well. And this time, the second New Deal, the emphasis changed to economic security to kind of protect Americans against poverty and unemployment. Um, and and a lot of the second New Dealers said we should really try to distribute wealth better in this country. So what ends up happening is Congress starts taxing the rich and big business, and starts to do things like electrifying rural farm areas. Because surprisingly enough, only 20% of people in rural areas had electricity in 1934. 20% of Americans in rural communities had electricity in 1934, but by 1950, 90% had it, and almost all possessed consumer goods. So the second New Deal was, I don't know what you would call it, more kind of about consumer equality and trying to make sure that we talked about last week, people had a quality of life, which is kind of how people are still defining freedom in a sense. Okay. Um, the second New Deal also comes up with the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration. Um, and this employed 3 million people, and they built thousands of public buildings. We're talking libraries, courthouses, 500,000 miles of roads, 600 airports, stadiums, pools, sewage treatment plants, um, anything that you can think of as a public work. The second New Deal put these people to work, almost 3 million people. They also did a lot of things for the arts. They had people tour the country and getting a glimpse for the first time of live theater, and this was all in the federal government's. The federal government paid for this, right? I mean, can you imagine seeing a play, getting electricity one year, and then the next year seeing a live play for the first time in your life? The federal government was doing all of this to try um, to try to, you know, jumpstart the economy and make life better for all Americans. The Wagner Act was passed, which allowed the NLRB, which is the National Labor's Board, to supervise union elections and to make sure that there were no unfair labor practices. This is also, with this government, you get Social Security, which for the first time you get the idea of the American welfare state. In 1935, Social Security was created. Um, and all of this says is that the government has a responsibility to ensure the material well-being of ordinary Americans. You get unemployment, old age pensions, disabled, elderly poor, and family with dependents, which are children. All of these things, you get tax breaks for all of these things. It's basically this idea of a social insurance. All of these things, some of them are not new, but what the New Deal does is it really solidifies all of these things, right? it really solidifies this social insurance. They actually did envision some type of health insurance, but the AMA was opposed to regulation of doctors' activities and incomes. And there were also some limitations as well because domestic and ag workers were not covered. So many domestic and domestic or housekeepers, ag workers were non-whites. So many unmarried women and non-whites were not covered. But the main thing is the idea is not whether the government should intervene, but how much it should. Okay, so gone were the days of deregulation and hands off. Those days were gone. Now the question was, how much should the government intervene? And they did this through communication. And FDR, not only was FDR a very good politician, but he knew that more than 2/3 of Americans owned radio, and he's the guy who kind of came up with these fireside chats, which were listened to avidly by everybody, where he would talk of liberty being the greater security for the average man, and he links freedom with economic security and standard of living. These are things that the president is saying to people sitting in their radio listening to him. My grandpa still talks about listening to baseball, boxing, and FDR on the radio, right? I mean, the radio was the TV back then, but not, you'd spend your Saturday night sitting on the porch listening to baseball and boxing, and then you'd listen to FDR talk, right? That's what people did to entertain themselves back then on a Saturday night if they weren't working. So while FDR was doing this and he's reaching all Americans through the radio, the election of 1936 comes up. And this is for the first time during an election, class division kind of shows up, and the conceptions of freedom differ sharply. FDR, in his 1936 election, argued that poor men are not free men. He says people who are economically savvy and who have more money were royalists, kind of, who sought to establish tyranny over the average man, so to speak. He's saying what's happening in this country now, this is his 1936 election kind of platform, is he's saying what's happening is that America is being taken over by the rich man, and he says that's a tyranny. And this resonated. This is populism all over again, right? This is what the 99% want to hear, right? So he wins the 1936 election with more than 60% of the votes, which is a huge, huge number. He gets organized labor to back him. He gets Northern African Americans to back him, Southern whites who are poor to back him, Protestant farmers, urban Catholics, and Jewish people, all of these people who feel like they don't have their equal amount piece of the pie. He gets all of these people to back him. He was a very, very savvy politician. 1936, so he wins the election with ease. And he actually wins the next election. Because of him, there are term limits. If he had not passed away before World War II was over, he probably would have won another election as well. He probably would have been elected 4 times. But because of him, there is a limit now on how many times you can be elected. Also 1936, this is an important time for a guy named John Maynard Keynes, and he's an economist, and he comes up with a general theory of employment that FDR kind of follows, and he talks about interest and money. And what Keynes says is, this is called Keynesian economics. He says that balancing the budget isn't that important. But he says what is important is that large-scale government spending is the key to sustaining purchasing power and how economies get stimulated in downturns. Okay, so we saw this a lot in 2008, right? We saw Keynesian economics. The federal government bailed out a lot of these big businesses. They sent people checks saying, and this is all John Maynard Keynes saying, when people have the power to purchase stuff, they will, and then that will get the economy going. And FDR follows it. Um, so FDR Keynes is it's basically public spending is what it is. It's the government spending money on the public. And FDR follows it, and he goes to Congress and he asks Congress for money to do these things to cut people who are poor checks so they'll start spending money and they'll have some purchasing power and they feel like they can rent a live not day to day. And instead of he goes to Congress and he asks for money, and instead of this kind of economic planning idea of the government kind of putting money in the economy but planning it and to do public works, things like that, it becomes this idea of public spending being the government's number one tool to get out of the depression. Okay, so what ends up happening is FDR comes out and says the only way that we're going to get out of this is if the federal government starts spending money and paying people to work and giving them food and giving them social security and making sure that every American can live comfortably, and in that way they'll start spending their money and the economy will start to flourish again. And as you might well imagine, there were a lot of people who disagreed with this. Um, but that's kind of the background of the second New Deal. We'll talk a lot more next week about kind of how America gets out of the doldrums, so to speak, because of World War II. But these are all ideas and implementations that FDR had. Okay, so for this last slide, we're going to quickly go through kind of the legacy of the New Deal, the good and the bad, and some of the limits of change that occurred throughout, even though for the first time basically in the history of the United States, the federal government was very much involved with the everyday running of a lot of things. We'll start with women, for example, the good and the bad. There were more in government than ever before during the 1930s, and a lot of this has to do with Eleanor Roosevelt, who turned kind of being the first lady into an actual base for political action. She was also a very savvy politician, very smart, knew what she was doing, eloquent. Any foreign dignitaries who came and visited her were very impressed with her. She traveled, she spoke, she wrote, she worked for civil rights, labor, work relief. But of all the things that Eleanor Roosevelt did do, at the same time, feminism kind of fades into the background in the 30s because as men keep losing their jobs, there was a push for women to give up their jobs for men. During World War I, when women were working and they were earning wages, and then afterwards, when some of them were still kept their jobs, and the whole idea of flappers and being able to smoke out in public and things like that, those things kind of stuck around. But at the same time, when men started losing their jobs, there was this real push for women to quit their jobs so men could have their jobs. In 1932, there was also the Economy Act, stating that both partners in a marriage could not be federal employees. So the whole reason why this was passed was so that the wives were getting fired from banks, schools, anything that had to do with being a government employee, so that men could take over those jobs, and many people weren't employing married women, even though constitutionally it was illegal not to hire somebody because she was a woman. People were getting around that. In the South, African Americans were still second-class citizens. Entitled whites took control of Congress, and excluding domestic work and agricultural work, most African Americans were left out of of what was going on in the South. They weren't getting jobs in management, jobs in offices or businesses. For the most part, African Americans were still kind of relegated to agricultural work and domestic employees. Um, this is also called the Southern Veto at the time. Um, and and in the 1930s, even though the New Deal was going strong, especially in the North and the West and the South, it was kind of looked upon at as a stigma to get a handout or to be on welfare, even if you were an African American or a Chinese American or a Mexican American, any type of person who would, in the eyes of many people, were second class citizens. It was still stigmatized to get handouts from the federal government, especially in the South. Um, African Americans also had to deal with the last hired, first fired syndrome. Um, and not to mention, there were many, many unemployed whites who thought being a porter or a waiter were below them at the time. But by the time the 1930s come around, they realized that that's not the case. They needed a job, and so they're taking a lot of the jobs that African Americans were taking at um, in the 1920s. Um, at the same time, in the North, African Americans were benefiting greatly from the New Deal projects, the work, the welfare, etc. And we kind of talked about the Harlem Renaissance earlier. By the 1930s, half the families in Harlem received public assistance, um, but it wasn't as stigmatized in the North. With the Renaissance going on and with a whole culture uh, brewing in the North, African Americans, even though they were still not equal to whites in a lot of people's eyes, um, they were still better off in the North. And there was this whole idea of don't shop where you can't work as well, meaning a lot of African Americans took pride in the fact that they would not go to places and buy food or clothes or anything like that who would not hire African Americans or Mexican, Puerto Rican Americans. Um, and this whole movement came about where don't support places where they wouldn't hire you. And this is kind of a sense of pride for a lot of people, which it should have been. Um, and this is kind of how a new conception of America comes to the forefront. Even though African Americans are left out for the most part, Jewish people and Catholics made a big part of FDR's team and voting base, and they began to being included. You have to remember that Jewish people and Catholics were targeted by the KKK this in the 1870s and the Second Coming. It's kind of hard to imagine nowadays, but 80 years ago, being Jewish and Catholic, Orange Catholic, was not the best thing in the world, right? America was very Protestant at the time. Um, Communists kind of had their heyday in the 1930s as well because of this whole federal government idea of spending and helping people, this people out. The CIO was at its strongest. It did make some gains in shaping politics and culture, um, and it kind of started to redraw the boundaries of freedom in America again. Kind of back to the New Deal idea. The New Deal, even though in some places it didn't work that great, the whole idea is that if you get together and you unionize and you get a whole bunch of people who have the same type of idea of freedom and what they want, which is basically economic freedom, then you can get things done. Okay? Um, and that's kind of how freedom changes from the late 1920s to early 30s, and we've kind of already talked about it. It especially in the North and the West, and not so much the South, where a lot of the Jewish people and the Catholics and the African Americans and the Puerto Rican Americans and the Italian Americans and they all Chinese Americans, they all start kind of becoming one with each other. You get this kind of ethnic and racial diversity in America in the 1930s. Remember, in the 1920s, it was all kind of about being American, kind of speaking English and uh, things of that nature. You kind of get this definition that ethnic and racial diversity was American, especially in the North. And this is kind of what the American way of life was. Um, it meant being a part of a citizenship, a social citizenship, so to speak. Um, right? If you lived in America, then that means you were an American. And this is not so much in the South, but it is definitely in the North for the most part, and in a lot of parts of the West. Um, you get these films that celebrate this populist ideal, such as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds. These are both great movies. Mr. Deeds, obviously Adam Sandler remade, but Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was an Orson Welles movie. If you guys are interested in older movies, talky black and white films, then watch these. These are all populist ideals of everybody's equal, and the poor aren't poor because they're lazy. It's just that they were born, bad luck or whatever happened to them. They need help as well because they are American too. You don't have to be rich to be an American kind of idea. Um, at the same time, by the mid 1930s to the late 1930s, you get the end of the New Deal. And really, by 1938, Southern Democrats and FDR were at odds with each other. And he kind of starts blaming the South for America's backwardness. The South lagged behind in industry, investment, education, public health. Um, but at the same time, many in the South began unionizing and talking about race relations and ethnic diversity, and many in the South were scared that um, this would encourage equality in the South. So in the 1938 congressional elections, they stonewall FDR, and for many years after that, conservative Southerners and Northern Republicans dominate Congress. So what ends up happening in 1938 is kind of what's happening in the world today. Um, it's just this um, idea that the Congress is held by one party and the president is another party, and so they kind of start being at odds with each other all the time, and not a lot gets passed. And this is kind of how the New Deal comes to an end, because a lot of Northern Republicans were against all the federal spending, and they didn't see what benefit that all of it had. And at the same time, you have people in the South who were completely against unionizing and this whole ethnic diversity that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt and a lot of the Democrats were talking about. So the New Deal kind of stagnates in 1938 because the Congress becomes a little more conservative. They kind of stifle each other. At the same time, in 1938, things kind of start beginning to shift towards what was happening in Europe. And maybe actually that was good for FDR. In 1938, FDR was still a popular president, but his popularity was waning. The New Deals weren't exactly uniting the country like he thought, and they weren't bringing economic fruition like they like he had wanted to. It did a lot of help for a lot of people, but at the same time, a lot of people were not helped by it, especially in the South. So what happens in 1938 real quickly in the world is this is when Hitler goes into Czechoslovakia and later invades Poland, and World War II starts. And this was kind of this was kind of a good thing for FDR because that meant that people turned attention away from kind of the end of the Second New Deal to what was going on in Europe. And people were scared of fascism and socialism. And this is something, since FDR was such a great politician, this is something he really clings to. Now, just to end real quickly, we'll talk about the legacy of the New Deals. I suppose, as compared to other welfare states such as Britain, Germany, France, etc., the New Deal itself is kind of small in scope, and it probably, especially in the South, may have made racial inequality even worse because FDR's main worry was not equality. Um, Equality in the sense of, you know, having people of color being equal to white people. FDR, he wasn't a racist, but when he's, and there's plenty of evidence of this, when he's talking about the New Deal, he's basically trying to help out people from the North and farmers and industrial workers and people in the West. And many of these people by this time are white. So, um, not saying FDR wasn't a good man, but his whole plan wasn't to create equality for everybody. Um, it greatly expanded the government's role in farming, as in what to plant, when to plant it, whether you could or not. He required employers to deal with unions. He ensured bank deposits, regulated the stock market, loaned money to homeowners, and created a social security. He built dams, reforestation projects. He electrified many rural areas, and he had innumerable public facilities, fountains, parks, libraries, courthouses, things of that nature. So those are all the pluses. And many people today say he basically saved democracy in America and he made people believe in their government again because when the government affects your daily lives and when the government is paying you to do work, then you have faith in the government again because you have to realize in 1929, 1930, 1931, a lot of Americans lost their faith in their government. Okay. Um, as far as freedom goes, it kind of changed the way people viewed it by including kind of a public guarantee, a government guarantee of economic security for ordinary citizens, and it identified economic equality as the greatest threat to American freedom. Okay, we're talking about economics here. We're not talking about anything else. Uh, FDR was a politician, and he surrounded himself with economists. Okay, so we're not talking about racial equality. We're not talking about gender equality, ethnic equality. We're talking about economic equality. Okay, so there's that needs to be considered. But at the same time, the one thing it failed to do was to generate a sustained prosperity for America because by 1940, more than 15% of the workforce were still unemployed, which was down 10%, but it took 10 years for it to go down 10%. And really, many people will argue that the only reason that the United States and the West in general came out of the Depression was because of World War II. And we will discuss that next week. Oh, and real quickly, the Scottsboro Boys. I don't want to talk about it too much just in case. It's an interesting case, so just in case you want to do your PowerPoint about it. These were 9 black teenagers accused of rape in 1931. And it was really a legal case that set the definition of kind of racism and the right to a fair trial. Anyways, the case is interesting because there were frame ups, lynchings, all kinds of backdoor deals, and nobody wanted to really help them. So if you're interested in the Scottsboro Boys, I would encourage you to take a look at it, and it kind of is a good example of how race relations were still a very hot topic in America in the 1930s. And so next week we're going to talk about how World War II kind of gets the United States out of its depression.